Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. If you were a Roman parent who wanted to terrify your children at night, there's a simple phrase that you would utter in Latin: Hannibal ad portas, which means Hannibal is at the gates. From the 3rd century BC up until the Western Roman Empire's collapse in the early 5th century AD, this simple phrase reminded Romans of the mortal threat that the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca posed to the Roman Empire. He was Rome's greatest adversary and the eternal boogeyman of the empire, and among military historians ranked the greatest general in history. In this episode, I'm going to be answering a question from listener Jennifer French Lee, who asks about Hannibal of Barca's tactics, battles, and anything else unique he did during the First Punic War. But I want to go way beyond battlefield tactics and look at who was Hannibal of Barca, who were the Carthaginians, what were the reasons for the Punic War, and why was there no other existential threat like this to the Roman Empire for centuries and centuries and centuries, and when we say that he's one of the greatest generals in history, what does this mean? How do we compare him to other generals, and did he have any qualities that made him fall short? Also, I want to look at probably his piece de resistance, the greatest military maneuver he did in his career, the double entrapment maneuver. I want to describe what it meant, why it was so difficult, and why people hail it as such an act of tactical and military brilliance. Well, let's start off with a snapshot of what his life was like growing up in Carthage, which was in northern Africa. Hannibal Barca's name means Baal is merciful to me. He was raised as a worshiper of an ancient Canaanite god that demanded child sacrifice in order to be appeased. When he was 7 years old, Hannibal stood at the edge of a sacrificial fire pit and saw his parents hand over his infant sibling to a priest. The robed figure held him before a bronze idol and raised arms. The priest slit the throat of the child, causing quick death, and placed the body on the outstretched hands of the statue. It remained there for a few moments before sliding into the fire. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, was a Carthaginian commander and leader in the mercenary war and the Punic conquest of Iberia. Hamilcar raised his son in the customs of Carthaginian society, which was founded in 814 BC as a Phoenician trading colony. Baal worship was as brutal in North African society as it had been 1,000 years earlier, when, at least according to Old Testament accounts, Canaanites slaughtered children by the gross. The Canaanites and later the Phoenicians stood out in Bronze Age society, so much to the point that in the Old Testament account, Yahweh orders Israel to completely destroy the civilization of Baal because they're a stain on the earth. Textual scholars have argued about the historicity of this account, but it seems that whether it's the Israelites or whether it's the Romans, the Canaanites, Phoenicians, and Carthaginians all struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. The chronicler Clitarchus wrote in the 3rd century BC that Carthaginian families promised at least one of their children to their gods in order to obtain favor. Plutarch notes that childless couples would purchase children from destitute families as a substitution. Contemporary Romans and Greeks found the practice barbaric. They thought that this was proof that Carthaginians deserved to be conquered, subdued, and, if need be, destroyed. But destroying Carthage would be very difficult and, under Hannibal, almost impossible. He represented the greatest existential threat to the young Roman Republic. The Punic Wars were fundamentally a struggle between Rome and Carthage over who would control the Mediterranean world. Rome dominated on the land, and Carthage dominated at sea. The Punic Wars are the clash between Rome and Carthage that we know best, but they were centuries and centuries and centuries into the making. Theodore Dodge sketches out the rise of Carthage in his book A History of the Art of War Among the Carthaginians and Romans down to the Battle of Pydna. Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians in their early settlement of Tyre. The Carthaginians acquired control of all Phoenician colonies on the Mediterranean. Their government was controlled by a senate, and some called them the London of Antiquity, with London being controlled by a parliament. And over time, Carthage extended conquest all around the western Mediterranean world. Carthage was protected by strong walls and had a vast commercial network. They had harbors and arsenals in order to project naval power. With Carthage at its center, the Carthaginians controlled North Africa in the way that the Romans controlled the Italian peninsula. The Phoenicians had originally been nomads inhabiting the plains of the Levantine, which extended from the Mediterranean to the Tigris, but they were pushed by Egyptians and others into the narrow region between Mount Libanus and the seashore, so they made the Mediterranean their home. Soon they commanded the entire commerce of the Mediterranean and became its most active pirates as well. Of all the towns, the biggest in activity and size was Tyre, which is in modern-day Lebanon. Phoenicians were celebrating antiquity for their wines, their salted fish, their mineral resources, but also for their learning. The Phoenician alphabet is probably their biggest lasting legacy. Overgrowth or discontent of the population lay at the root of emigration from Tyre. From 1000 to 600 BC, Tyre founded many colonies, all of them westward and on the Mediterranean coast. Herodotus, who visited Tyre around 450 BC, said that the city was 2,300 years old at the time. Now, he's often known to exaggeration and couldn't know the exact date, but other ancient documents of the Bronze Age in the Old Testament also mention Tyre prominently. Tyre resisted sieges from the Babylonians, the Persians, but was eventually conquered by the daughter states of Alexander the Great. Carthage was founded in the 9th century BC as a trading colony, and the new colony carried on the commercial affairs of the Athenians and eventually won the supremacy of all cities on the African coast. The population of Carthage was increased by immigration from the mother country. Its form of government was something of an aristocracy of capitalists, or maybe an oligarchy you could say, with limited popular suffrage, controlled by a senate of 104 members. Aristotle called it a democracy inclining towards an oligarchy. The executive officers were 2 magistrates, who were like the Spartan kings and annually elected by the citizens. But there was a council of 28 elders, elected at the same time, who possessed the main power. Well, whatever its form of government, Carthage was constantly at war, usually for commercial reasons. In the 6th century BC, the ruler Mago I is said to have laid the foundations of Carthage's solid military organization. The ruler was the first of a line of generals who made Carthage celebrated for 150 years for its military power. And its commercial navy grew into a military arm. The height of Carthage's power was from the beginning of the 5th to the middle of the 3rd century BC. Carthage was on the coast, but it stood on an overlook 200 feet above sea level, giving it an excellent view of the surrounding country and a great defensive situation. After the city of Carthage was destroyed in 146 BC, it was excavated and used as a quarry site throughout the Middle Ages. The Cathedral of Pisa in Italy, among many other structures, was built from blocks of marble dug from the ruins. Well, Hannibal came of age when Mediterranean powers scrambled to gain supremacy over neighboring states due to a power vacuum in the region. Carthage contended with Rome, the city-state of Syracuse, where Archimedes was from, and the deteriorating daughter states of Alexander's former empire, Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, and Ptolemaic Egypt. Hannibal certainly had the intelligence and determination to make his North African city-state the preeminent state in the ancient world. But for all of his successes on the battlefield, Hannibal was unable to achieve final victory over the other claimants to Mediterranean supremacy. This was partly due to his inability to win the long game of the Second Punic War, despite his successes at the short game. And for all of Hannibal's grand strategy as a military tactician, he failed as a statesman to convert military victories into political gains, and he also failed at the retail politics of winning over the Carthaginian aristocracy to his side. Hannibal's legacy is also distorted due to the biased sources that survive him. There are no historical accounts of his life that survived the Third Punic War and the Roman destruction of Carthage. No Carthaginians left any account of his life, and all that remain are accounts by Roman chroniclers who are employed to present him as the enemy of civilization. So as a result, they depict his life and times in the most negative manner possible. Of the 37 authors that mention him, not a single comment is positive. But these authors had to admit that he was an incredible tactician even if this was to emphasize that his final defeat made Rome's ascendancy all the more glorious. Hannibal was born in 247 BC, and his father Hamilcar had led the Carthaginians at the end of the First Punic War with Rome. The war ended when Hamilcar surrendered Sicily to Rome and peace was negotiated. Not resting for a moment, he quickly set out to improve the fortunes of the state and fix its dismal financial condition. Hamilcar first subjugated the tribes of the Iberian Peninsula in order to get tribute from them. This wasn't simple because the Carthaginian navy was so strapped for resources after its war with Rome that the troops couldn't be transported by ship all the way to Iberia. Instead, they were marched to the Pillars of Hercules and crossed into Europe by being transported across the Strait of Gibraltar. Hamilcar took his young son on the campaign, but only under the condition that Hannibal swore never to be a friend of Rome. So Hamilcar was still licking his wounds after the loss in the First Punic War. At home, Carthage remained in a delicate situation. The government struggled to quell uprisings among former mercenaries who hadn't been paid for their services in the war. Rome took advantage of the disarray by capturing the Carthaginian islands of Sardinia and Corsica. Rome's eye was on territorial expansion at the expense of its enemy. Hamilcar succeeded in carving out new overseas territories of Carthage and Iberia by expanding upon initial dominions. He also had a reputation for lightning-fast raids. His speed in battle resulted in the honorary title that he received from other Carthaginians, Barak, or Barca. Barak in Semitic translates to lightning flash, and Hannibal carried this moniker as well. Hamilcar died in 229 BC by drowning in battle during the conquest of Hispania, or in Iberia. Hasdrubal, his son-in-law, succeeded him, who preferred accommodation to Rome instead of aggression. He consolidated Carthage's holdings in Iberia and signed a treaty with Rome stating he wouldn't expand north of the Ebro River as long as Rome didn't expand beyond its south. Before Hannibal took command of Carthaginian forces in Spain, he attained a high level of education. Some accounts claim that he followed the Greek military tradition of being tutored in the way that Alexander was by Aristotle, and some accounts claim that the young general took Greek tutors out on military campaigns, like in the case of the Spartan historian Sicellos, who accompanied Hannibal on his expedition across the Alps. And his education wasn't just for show. Hannibal, even in his exile after the Second Punic War, authored books in Greek, and one of his works pertained to campaigns conducted by his Roman enemy, Manlius Vulso in Asia Minor. The book was written as a military manual for defending roads. Anyway, let's get back to the treaty with Rome and Carthage that separated the two by a river. The treaty was really only an armistice. Hasdrubal worked quietly behind the scenes to shore up support on the European continent and raise up an army to attack Rome again. He arranged a marriage between Hannibal and the Iberian princess Imilce. Hasdrubal himself was a sharp tactician and prepared the overland campaign to Italy that Hannibal would execute years later. But none of his plans came to fruition as he was assassinated in 221 BC. Hannibal was appointed to succeed him at the age of 26. The young commander-in-chief quickly returned to his father's aggressive military approach. He completed the conquest of Hispania by capturing military fortifications and garrisons. Rome feared his growing strength and allied with the city of Saguntum, which was south of the river Ebro. Hannibal considered this a breach of the treaty signed after the First Punic War. He pressed on with the siege and captured Saguntum after 8 months before directing his attention toward Italy. The capture of Saguntum sat poorly with Rome. They demanded Hannibal's extradition for violation of the treaty, but Hannibal didn't want to wait for Roman forces to come to him and be deported to Rome and be tortured and executed. He consolidated his family's hold on power and appointed his brother, also named Hasdrubal, as commander. He crossed the river Ebro, and the Second Punic War with Rome officially began. Hannibal desired to carry the war through Hispania and Gaul into central Italy. His foes expected an easy defeat against a small city-state that was punching above its military weight. What they didn't expect was a protracted war against an enemy who used military tactics that had never been seen before in the ancient world, and a long, devastating war of attrition that would follow. Now let's take a little segue to look at how Carthage organized its military. For both its army and its navy, Carthage depended on mercenaries that it got from dependent